New Mexico Territory, 1882. The last thing Rowan Hale expected to find at a livestock auction was the reason his heart had stopped working 3 years ago, and the woman who would quietly, without a single word, teach it how to beat again. The sun was bleeding out behind the mesa, orange, red, the color of things ending. Dust rose in slow curtains from the corral where the last cattle of the season stood, waiting to be claimed. The crowd should have gone home by now. Suppers were getting cold. Children were waiting. But nobody moved. Nobody left. Because of the girl. Rowan stood at the far edge of the crowd with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who had decided a long time ago that the world had nothing left to surprise him. At 36, he was broad and weathered, the kind of man the desert builds slowly, not with cruelty, but with patience. 12 miles east of town, his ranch sat quiet beneath an open sky, a small house, a leaning barn, a windmill that turned and turned through every lonely night like it was counting something he had lost track of. He had driven 12 miles for a horse. He had not driven 12 miles for grief. But grief, he had learned, does not wait for an invitation. 3 years ago, he had buried his wife Clara on the hill behind the house. She had been 29 years old, and she had laughed easily, and she had loved the sound of rain on the roof. And then one morning in October, she was simply gone, taken by a fever that moved faster than any doctor could follow. He had held her hand through the last night and felt, when the stillness finally came, that something essential had been removed from him. Not broken, removed, like a stone pulled from a wall. Everything else still standing, but the structure no longer quite right. After Clara, he stopped coming to town much, stopped talking much, stopped expecting much. The ranch became less a home and more a place where he waited, though he could not have told you what he was waiting for. He had come today for a horse. Then he saw her. She stood just inside the corral fence, barefoot in the red dirt, and she was the stillest thing in that entire restless crowd. No older than 20, dark hair loose and tangled, her dress torn at one shoulder, dust on her skin like it had been there for days. She wasn't crying, she wasn't struggling. She stood the way a person stands when they have already lived through the worst possible thing and come out the other side of it not destroyed, but stripped down to something essential and unbreakable. There was a rope around her wrist, tied tight. Not the way you'd hold a child's hand, the way you'd secure an animal you didn't trust. The man holding the other end swayed on his feet, whiskey on his breath from 10 feet away, a bottle in his free hand, swinging carelessly. Rowan recognized him, Dylan Marsh, a drifter who had passed through the territory twice before, leaving small disasters in his wake each time. "Got yourself a real curiosity here," Marsh called out to the crowd, tugging the rope. The girl stumbled one step forward and caught herself without a sound, without a flinch. "She don't talk. Don't hear nothing you say to her. Born that way, far as anybody knows." He grinned. "But she works, strong as anything. Don't complain." He looked around with the confidence of a man who had never once been ashamed of himself. "Her mother's gone. I've been her father's partner 3 years. Man died owing me considerably. I'm collecting what I'm owed." Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Nobody spoke. Rowan turned away. He was not a hard man, but he was a practical one. He had one life to maintain and barely enough energy to maintain it. He could not carry someone else's suffering on top of his own. He turned toward the horse pen and told himself to keep walking. He took 4 steps and stopped. Not because of a sound, because of the absence of one. In all that noise, he felt a stillness reach out and touch him. He turned back despite himself. She was looking directly at him. Not pleading, not desperate, not performing sorrow for the crowd. She was looking at him the way you look at something you have seen before in a different life, with a recognition that has no logical explanation. Steady and quiet and absolutely certain. Rowan had looked into a lot of eyes in his life. He had looked into Clara's eyes the night she died, and he had recognized in them a peace that had nearly destroyed him with its beauty. This girl's eyes held something different. Not peace, but endurance. The kind that costs everything and leaves you standing anyway. "She comes with the mare," Marsh said, noticing Rowan's pause and sensing a transaction. "Horse is injured. Take her cheap. Girl comes free. I just want her gone." Behind her, a bay mare stood trembling against the fence, ribs visible, one foreleg swollen and badly wrapped with a filthy strip of cloth. The horse's eyes were glassy with exhaustion and pain. Rowan stood there. The crowd watched him. He thought about Clara, about the empty house, about the windmill counting his losses through the night. "I'll take both," he said. The laughter that followed him to the payment table was the kind men use when something makes them uncomfortable and they don't have the courage to say so honestly. He ignored it. He counted out the coins, not enough, never enough for a life, but the number Marsh wanted, and when the rope was handed to him, he looked at it for one moment. Then he untied the knot at her wrist, slowly, carefully, and he dropped the rope in the dirt. "No ropes," he said quietly, knowing she couldn't hear him, saying it anyway because some things need to be said aloud even when nobody can hear them. She looked at the rope in the dirt, then up at him. Then she stepped to the side and slightly behind him, not cowering, not clinging, just choosing a direction. Choosing from among all the directions available to her, the one that led away from Dylan Marsh. He told himself it meant nothing. He walked to the wagon, she followed. The ride home crossed 12 miles of open country turning purple and then black beneath a sky reckless with stars. The injured mare was tied behind, moving slowly. Rowan kept the pace gentle. The girl sat behind him, wrapped in a blanket he'd pulled from beneath the seat, and she did not sleep. He could feel her attention, not anxious, not watchful in the way of fear, watchful the way of someone memorizing something they intend to keep. He thought about Clara the whole way home. He thought about how she used to sit beside him on this same wagon and talk enough for both of them, filling the night air with her voice until the silence of the ranch felt inhabited rather than empty. He thought about how 3 years of quiet had changed him in ways he hadn't fully measured until tonight, until this stranger's steady eyes had found something in him across a crowded corral and refused to look away. At some point, her fingers touched his coat sleeve, light as a moth, gone instantly. He didn't turn around, but he felt it settle somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where the stone had been removed, and he thought, without meaning to, there. His ranch was modest and honest, and he realized as he pulled up to it with a passenger for the first time in 3 years, very quiet. He helped her down from the wagon without making it an offer she had to accept. He simply made the help available and let her decide. She stepped down on her own, stood in the yard and looked around slowly, the way you look at something you were drawing inside yourself for safekeeping. Inside, he lit the lamp, pointed to the stove, the kettle. She understood without hesitation. She moved to it as if kitchens were a language she had always spoken. He sat at the table and watched a stranger make tea in Clara's kitchen and felt something so complicated he had no name for it. After supper, he placed a piece of chalk on the table, tapped the wood, pointed to her. She considered him for a moment. Then she crouched, and in careful, deliberate letters she wrote on the dark tabletop, "Ilara." He read it once, twice, said it aloud, "Ilara," into the quiet kitchen, into the lamplight, into the space where Clara's voice used to live. Something shifted, not loudly. The way light shifts when a cloud moves. You don't see the moment it changes, only that everything looks slightly different than it did before. He found her in the barn at sunrise, kneeling beside the injured mare, with water she had already heated and cloth she had already prepared. Her hands moved with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct, the kind that comes from a lifetime of paying attention to things other people walk past. The horse stood completely still, not resigned, trusting. He watched from the doorway for a long time, learning something he hadn't known he needed to learn. The weeks that followed found their own quiet rhythm. She worked without instruction, swept floors, mended broken tack, carried water before he thought to ask. Every morning he found small chalk messages on the doorframe. East fence post is loose. The old dog favors his left leg. Something is wrong. Storm in 2 days. Move the hay inside. He followed every instruction. She was right every time. One evening he came back from town with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the ride. Old talk had surfaced again, land disputes, his father's name attached to debts and decisions that Rowan had spent years quietly paying for without ever being free of the shame. He sat on the porch after supper and stared at the ridge and felt the familiar weight of inherited guilt pressing down on him. He didn't hear her come out, but she sat beside him, close, not touching, and after a long moment, she placed her hand over his chest, gently, directly over the place where the weight lived. Then she looked toward the hill behind the house, toward the grave marker standing quiet among the dry winter grass. He had never told her about Clara. He had never told her about his father. He had told her nothing. "How do you know these things?" he whispered. She couldn't hear the question, but she looked at him with those steady eyes, and what passed between them in that moment needed no translation. "I see you, not the outside of you, the real, unguarded, aching interior of you, and I am not afraid of it." It was the first time since Clara that Rowan Hale felt truly, completely seen. The town talked. It always does. Fear spreads fastest through silence, and silence was the one thing Ilara carried with her, always. They came one cold afternoon, 4 men at the gate, not shouting, but positioned in the way of men who have already decided the outcome of a conversation. "We want her gone," the one in front said. "She unsettles people. She watches things too close. Harlan's dog died the day after she touched it." Rowan came off the porch slowly. He looked at each face. "She stays," he said. "She ain't normal, Rowan." He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he thought about Clara dying young, and his father's name dragged through whispers, and 12 miles of empty road driven alone in every season for 3 years. He thought about what normal had ever done for him. "Neither am I," he said. The men stood there. Then they left, and something in Rowan's chest, something that had been uncertain since the day at the auction, settled into place like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Winter came soft and white and transforming. Ilara stitched him a heavy coat from wool scraps she had been quietly collecting for weeks. He found it folded on the table one morning with no ceremony, no expectation, no request of acknowledgement. He stood in the kitchen holding it and understood, perhaps for the first time, the difference between being cared for and being loved. They are not always the same thing. Sometimes love is simply a coat on a cold morning made by hands that thought of you before you thought of yourself. He was thrown from a horse on a January afternoon, a patch of ice, bad luck, nothing broken but his pride and the skin on one hand. He came in from the cold to find her already at the door, already waiting. He had not been gone long enough for her to have been told, but she was there. She cleaned the wound with the same steady gentleness she gave every injured thing, and when she finished, she paused, and she pressed her lips to the back of his hand, not urgently, not dramatically, quietly. The way you touch something you have decided, without announcement, belongs to your heart. He did not speak. She did not look up immediately. When she did, the lamplight was in her eyes, and everything neither of them had words for was there instead. He ordered a book from Santa Fe, learned her language slowly, imperfectly, the signs for mourning and careful and I'm sorry and thank you. She was a patient teacher. She never laughed at his mistakes, only corrected them gently and waited for him to try again. He thought sometimes that she had been teaching patience her entire life, that the world's refusal to meet her where she was had made her generous with those who were trying. One night by the fire, he signed to her, clumsy, earnest, the way a man speaks a language he has only just begun to love. "You brought life back here." She watched his hands, then his face. Then she reached out and touched his lips. Not a kiss, but the gesture that in her language meant, "I hear you," even without sound, even across every wall the world had built between two people who had both spent too long on the wrong side of silence. The storm came on a February night without warning. She pulled him awake by his coat, urgent, certain. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. Outside, the wind had become something with intent. Inside the barn, the horses were in full panic, kicking, screaming, the old beams groaning under a pressure they were never built to hold. "Ilara!" He called her name and immediately felt the uselessness of it. But she was already inside, moving through the chaos without hurry, not because she was unafraid, but because fear had never been the thing that guided her. Stall to stall, hand to neck, her presence moving through those terrified animals like a current of calm, steadying each one, turning their panic into something she could lead. She guided them out one by one into the cold and the snow, while Rowan worked the door and the ropes and tried to keep up with her. The last horse cleared the door. The roof came down. The sound was enormous, timber and wind and the end of something, snow and dust together. Then silence. Rowan stood in the white field with 8 horses around him, every one of them breathing hard but safe, every one of them standing as close to her as they could get. She stood in the storm light with her hair wild and her breath coming in clouds, and her eyes, those steady, ancient eyes, looking at him with the same expression she had worn the very first day. Certain, quiet, already knowing what he was only just now understanding. He looked at her, this woman who could not hear thunder but had felt it coming through the ground before the sky gave any sign. This woman who had been sold for less than a broken horse and had walked into his empty life and filled it, quietly and without asking permission, with more meaning than he had built in 36 years of trying alone. He had told himself that afternoon at the auction that he was the one doing the rescuing. He had been wrong about that from the very first moment. She had looked across that dusty corral and seen a man with a stone-shaped hole where his hand, where someone he loved used to be. And she had chosen him, not because she needed saving, but because she recognized in his particular kind of quiet something that matched her own. She had never needed rescuing. He had, and she had known it before he took a single step. The snow fell around them, soft and clean and covering everything that had broken, and Rowan Hale looked at Ilara, whole and standing, and choosing him still, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the windmill turning through the night was no longer counting his losses. It was counting something else entirely. Something that, this time, he intended to keep. Some people enter your life not to be saved, but to save you. Not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty that you are worth staying for. That is not a small thing. In a loud and careless world, that is everything. If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you that love doesn't always speak in words, that strength doesn't always make noise, and that the people who change our lives most completely sometimes arrive in the most unexpected ways, then Desert Heart is where you belong. Subscribe and stay close. Every story here is made for hearts that still believe in quiet miracles. This story holds meaningful value on multiple levels. It brings genuine dignity to the deaf community, showing not disability, but a different and often richer way of experiencing the world. It explores grief honestly, showing how loss can quietly hollow a person out, and how healing rarely arrives the way we expect it to. It challenges the viewer to examine how fear of difference drives communities to reject what they do not understand. It models the kind of love that is built not on grand gestures, but on presence, patience, and the willingness to learn a new language for someone worth the effort. And for older American audiences especially, it affirms something deeply needed, that it is never too late to be found, never too late to let someone in, and never too late for a life that felt finished to begin again.